Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Wise Body Podcast, where we talk about eating disorder recovery and all things body. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Hughes. I bring 20 years of experience as an eating disorder therapist, and I've worked with hundreds of clients to feel more empowered and connected to their body by tapping into the wisdom it holds. I'm so excited to keep learning with you as we navigate the windy path that is recovery. So let's get started. Hi, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of the Wise Body Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Hughes. Today, I am so excited to introduce my next guest, the amazing, brilliant Dr. Gaudiani. Dr. Gaudiani is the founder and medical director of the Gaudiani Clinic in Denver, Colorado. She is board certified in international medicine, completed her undergrad degree at Harvard, medical degree at Boston University, and her internal medicine residency and chief residency at Yale. Prior to founding the Gaudiani Clinic in 2016, she served as the medical director at the Acute Center for Eating Disorders. The Gaudiani Clinic offers specialized trauma-informed outpatient medical care to individuals seeking support for eating disorders, undernourishment related to complex medical issues, and weight-inclusive primary care. The Gaudiani Clinic is based in Denver, Colorado, with a satellite location in North Carolina, and is licensed to practice in almost every U.S. state via thoughtful telemedicine. Please welcome Dr. G. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Body Podcast, Season 2. So excited to start this new season with the most wonderful, brilliant guest, colleague and friend, Dr. Jennifer Gaudiani, or Dr. G, as we all love to call her. I'm so incredibly honored to have you here, and I really appreciate you taking the time. I know your time is so valuable, and you give so much of yourself to this work and to your clients. And so I'm so incredibly honored that you've found some time to talk on the show today. And so thank you for spending some of your time with me today.
I'm so excited to see you and to just get to have this cozy little session, just you and me, that then ends up getting shared with the lovely humans who listen to this important podcast.
Thank you. Yeah. And that's really what I've always aimed and wanted it to be, is a very comfortable and casual series of conversations with like friends and colleagues that are doing this work. And so, yeah, this really falls in line with that and what I think is important. So without further ado, I really just want to start with talking about your book, which I embarrassingly admitted to you before jumping on that I just finished this morning, and it's been out in the world since 2018. And I started reading it then, but finished it this morning. The last few chapters, I really wanted to complete it. So it was a really good goal for me in having you on to finish your book. And it's so brilliant and has become another Bible for me in my library. And so other than hearing this so much from your patients that they don't feel sick enough, right? And I know you've talked about that a lot on podcasts and in blogs and things that you write in reference to this book, that patients don't feel sick enough to warrant treatment or care. So aside from that solid reason to write the book, are there other reasons why you wrote this book? Like beginning with the first edition,
Yeah. So in the beginning, in 2017, which was just 1 year into starting my outpatient clinic, I thought to myself, okay, I thought I knew the medical complications of eating disorders after my 8 years at a hospital program. And then I was about a year into outpatient practice, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much I didn't know. And I had wonderful, generous teachers in the form of my patients and their families, as well as teachers in the community, in the field. And I thought my goal when I founded this clinic was to improve the quality of medical care for people with eating disorders around the world. And I thought, there's only going to be so many who will be able to actually come and receive care from me and my partners. And then there'll be only so many who can listen to a particular podcast where I talk about some of the details in the book. I think it's right for me to try to create something that could be used for patients, their families, and clinicians to help understand what's happening with our bodies. And then what are the best medical ways and what are the most loving psychological ways in which we can communicate about those and help remove barriers from people's eating disorder recovery process. And, I was so deeply moved after Sick Enough 1 came out in 2018. The lovely stories that I've heard from around the world where people said, in addition to my wonderful vital outpatient team, reading the book helped me understand my body. It helped my parents understand what I'm going through. It helped my GP give me better treatment, and it really helped set me on the road. So that felt amazing. And I couldn't have been more grateful and psyched, and it was a done project. And then 7 years went by. And it was 7 years of ongoing, enormous knowledge base gain for me with the clinical work and the ongoing teaching and with bringing on more partners into my practice. And I just learned so much more. And I thought, oh man, it has to happen. Mm-hmm. So in the fall of 2024, I did the thing that proved to be much more painful than I thought it would be. And I broke up Sick Enough 1 in order to start thinking about Sick Enough 2. And, I'm a girl who puts a little open checkbox next to everything in my life because I love checking off that checkbox. So to take an entire book that had reflected a series of hard-fought checkboxes and to open all of them back up again was like, super challenging psychologically for me. But, I'd start to read a chapter and I'd be like, okay, there's a lot of stuff here that I still really like. It's classic canon that stays true. And then I read stuff and I was like, no, we know better than this. We know different than this. I know more than this. This needs to be shifted. And so each chapter that I wrote after doing this super intensive medical lit review and stuff, I would start the new chapter and be like, and then by the end, I would be like, this is so much better. And this is going to help people. So, a bunch of things went into the decision to write the second edition, which is coming out November 10th, 2025. It's 60% longer. It includes information about neurodiversity and much more information about ARFID and atypical anorexia. Hate the name, but it's an entity that has to be discussed. A lot more about recovery themes and about MAST cell activation syndrome and POTS and complex digestive issues. And the publisher, because this was, in the greater scheme of books, this is a tiny book. In the world of eating disorders, this is like a reasonably big thing. And my publisher was like, we can do it as a trade book this time and make it cheaper. And I was like, yes, how about we put in more info and make it cost less and actually have it available in bookstores, which as a total bibliophile myself, who loves nothing more than walking into a bookstore.
I know.
Smelling the paper. It feels really exciting. Yeah. And I just thought, I think that with so much more awareness, even in the world of athletics, about how athletes are undernourishing themselves, in a world of GLP-1 agonists like Zepbound and its cousins, there are people becoming undernourished and experiencing complications, and physicians still, for the most part, don't really know starvation medicine. So I thought, the addressable audience is bigger. I know more. Let's do this. And so I did it.
Well done. I cannot wait to get my hands on it. I have my hands on the first edition because this is as close as I can get to the second one, but I will pre-order on November 10th. And I mean, there are Post-it notes, some that are like faded, because literally I have proof, faded Post-its because I started it so long ago. So brilliant. And sorry, your writing is so good. And I know that you were a poetry major. I geeked out on your bio a little bit, and you can tell. And I started writing like at the end of your book. Like I didn't start this in the beginning, but at the end I caught on to like how beautifully you write. And I'm like, I literally wrote like beautifully written. And I'm going to pull some of those out because I love how you say things in such this like beautiful, like nurturing, lovely, articulate, to the point way. You're so good with the word. So I will get to that. But my own thoughts about like when I heard the title of your book were, thinking about like the barriers to care, which like ranging from like, I mean, I think this is intuitive maybe, but patients, I'm saying patients because you are a doctor and we're speaking in the medical model, but patients minimizing their symptoms, and also maybe ranging from that to like a doctor who maybe not intentionally invalidating their experience and what they really need due to weight bias. Like another reason why this book needs to be written or needed to be written. And I also thought of, another great reason for this book was because of how like wildly misunderstood eating disorders are. And I feel like that's like a common theme in a lot of my episodes. I'm like, here's another myth. Here's another misconception. Let's push up against this. Let's talk about what this really is. So this is just such truth about eating disorders. And you're a doctor, and these are lit reviews. This is scientific research that is supporting what you're saying. And that's the best kind of book in my mind. And so thank you for writing it and sharing your knowledge and putting it out there. And I love when you say, like, my goal was to basically change the world, but I couldn't do that. And so, but this can, because it can reach everyone, right? Like you have just this wonderful dream, of trying to change the world about how we think about bodies and food and eating disorders. And this is helping. And so thank you for your effort. And I join you in it. And my hope is that that's the purpose of this podcast. And so I really am so grateful to you and just honored for you to be here. Again, another question about the books. I refer to your book a lot with my clients when, particularly if they're minimizing their eating disorder or any of the symptoms. And I literally just say like the top eating disorder doctor wrote this book because she heard it so much, and I'm hearing it now from you. And so now that this first edition has turned 7, right? How do you see your book having, like, how do you see it changing, like, the world? I don't mean to be dramatic here, but like, how do you see it having an impact on like this population, people with eating disorders? Like, I think you mentioned it a little bit, just like that was the reason for the second edition, because it touched so many people. How are you seeing it change lives?
Like you said, I'm not a girl with small hopes and dreams, but actually the way that I think change gets made is on a one-on-one basis. That if one patient reads the book and is like, okay, I needed to see the words in this way about the fact that even when my labs are all normal, I'm still sick enough to challenge my ED and do really scary things with rest and nourishment. That even when my weight is at a level where doctors, unfortunately, are constantly telling me that I should be losing weight, and that feeds into my ED, I'm going to try not to listen to them, even though they have a lot of power. And I'm going to recognize that I have a life-threatening eating disorder and that I deserve to receive not only weight inclusive, but fat positive care that sees me as a whole person without stigma. I just hope that people see themselves in the vignettes. I created vignettes both in the first book and then even more so in the second book that were drawn from a million different patient encounters where I hoped that folks would be like, ooh, that feels like me. And personalizing science, I think, again, like you said, I was an English major. So when you can tell a story, I think that's the spoonful of sugar that helps the scientific medicine go down. It allows people to see themselves in it. And that's what I want to do. And I know that individual people have been benefited. My hope is that this book hits at a time when folks are particularly eager for good science, well researched, well thought out, well practiced over, my 17 years of experience being in the field, and where they see the synthesis of science and of joy, compassion, respect, and delight in the humans who have eating disorders themselves, that I feel, that my partners feel in the work that we do, and are like, okay, wait, this is approachable. I can see this. I can maybe bring it to my interested nurse practitioner and be like, hey, would you look at this chapter? Because I think if you read this, we could make some progress together. I'm never going to be able to, happen to see Dr. G or one of her partners, but I think you and I could do this work. Or bring a chapter to their allergist and be like, you've always been so kind to me, Dr. So-and-so, but you haven't been really a believer in mast cell before. Would you look at this chapter and just, can we talk about how it really maps onto my symptoms? And would you be open to trying some of these things? Because you're exactly right that all I want to do is remove barriers to people's recovery journeys. And there are a gazillion barriers out there. I won't name the ones that are probably obvious to you and me and to your very sophisticated listeners, but there are some that maybe aren't spoken as often as they need to be. And one of the barriers is medical trauma. Trauma that is imposed by a usually well-meaning medical system upon our beloved patients because of a lack of knowledge base. The practitioner just doesn't know about this. And so either they bluster or they minimize or they deny. It's brought about by people who don't want to or don't feel comfortable holding complexity. And so they try to turn our patients' vitally important medical complexity that often occurs over a long period of time into something short and simple. And then when the short and simple solution they offer to that doesn't result in lasting relief, it becomes the patient's fault. And when they discount what the patients say is happening in their bodies because it's not measurable, and then we go back and say, gosh, it's so weird that people with eating disorders just discount their symptoms. We're like, oh my gosh, the system has been discounting them for years. And that's the point of power. My doctor didn't believe my stomach pain was anything but nerves because the endoscopy was normal and the labs were normal and the stool tests were normal. And then somehow we have the audacity to tell patients that they really need to work on their insight into how their body works because they're alexithymic. I don't know. I think we have to acknowledge where the problems come in. And in so doing, even if we're not creating solutions, we're at least naming it, which takes some of the burden off of our beloved patients.
Yeah. Well, and I think your book is an example of validation, right? Like this is real, it exists, even if there's not a test for it, even if it's immeasurable, right? I know you've given this example before, like migraines, and I woke up with one this morning, and took my medicine and now it's gone. Thank God. Thank you, modern medicine, for working. But there's no test for that. I mean, if you're my doctor, how are you feeling? My head is killing. And you kind of go off of that. And something I know that I had said before we hopped on here, which you're highlighting, is that when someone sees their doctor, right, and maybe gets dismissed, or if everything gets blamed on weight, right, the simple solution to a very complex problem, which is happening a lot in America right now, but it reinforces this power dynamic between patient and doctor. And then it also sends this message of from the doctor, I know your body more than you do. And so it reinforces this idea, which happens in eating disorders: do not listen to your body. You are not intuitive, which an eating disorder I know does sort of can take away that intuition and your knowingness. But I think a doctor's maybe well-intended, but wrong message tells the patient again, you can't trust yourself and you can't trust your body. They're all already thinking that. And that's why they're listening to the eating disorder to tell me what to do. I need some direction and I need some steps, some very rigid steps. And I like your approach of putting, the individual first and a holistic, really practicing what you're preaching. Because I think a lot of people will say, I practice holistic medicine, but you really, really do. And we've shared some mutual clients, so I know that you do. And that's so important because this is so messy. And I think it's okay to say, I don't know, let's try this. Especially, I think this is leading me into my next question. With some of these, I'm calling them mystifying diagnoses, and that's because I don't know enough about them. And I'm so glad that you've included them in your book, and I can't wait to read more in depth in your second edition on these. But I think, people don't really maybe understand what mast cell is, what POTS is, Ehlers Danlos, and how they show up with eating disorders too. I know that's a lot of diagnoses and you can take it wherever you want, but can you talk a little bit about mast cell and POTS and Ehlers Danlos if you want, and just how they co-occur with eating disorders, how you see them, and just your approach with working with people with these diagnoses that people do not know about?
I would love to.
Okay.
Yeah, I would love to. And my own knowledge base continues to evolve on all this. But here's the story. Shortly after starting the clinic, one of the things I realized that I was grossly inadequately knowledgeable about was postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And I had a number of patients who joined the clinic who said, my eating disorder recovery work is being impeded by the fact that I feel exhausted all the time. That every time I stand up, my heart races. I feel like I'm going to pass out. Sometimes I do pass out. Sometimes when I stand, I feel nauseated. Sometimes when I stand, I feel enraged, or my face turns beet red. I feel like I'm reacting to everything in the world in a physical way. And it makes me fearful of eating because, like any mammal, if you give negative conditioning, they will avoid the stimulus that caused the pain. And so I thought, geez, I got to understand more about this. So I read up on POTS. And then I started seeing this term come up, which was MAST, M-A-S-T, cell activation syndrome, shorthanded as MCAS. And the few papers that mentioned it said, if somebody has MCAS and POTS, but their MCAS hasn't been diagnosed and properly treated, their POTS is never going to get better. And I was like, well, this seems like I should learn about this too. So I dove into the world of MCAS and started reading everything I could, getting consultation from experts and really trying to broaden my knowledge. And here's what I learned. This is going to tie into Ehlers Danlos and hypermobility as well. It seems that maybe as much as 1 in 5 people in the general population, I'm guessing it's probably even more than that in the eating disorder population, but there's no data, has a sort of inherited epigenetic tendency for their mast cells, which I'll describe, to become hyperreactive. Okay, what does this mean? So mast cells, we all have them, are part of our immune system. They hold our histamine granules, as well as up to 1,000 other inflammatory mediators. Mast cells live at the junction of nerve endings and blood vessels, especially in places in our body where the outside world comes into contact with the inside world. So that's eyes, sinuses, mouth, all the way through the digestive tract to anus, skin, lungs, and genitourinary tissues, including uterus, etc. Mast cells should keep their contents inside them. They should not release them unless there's been a very serious allergic or toxic exposure. And then the idea is that they release the inflammatory mediators to try to help your body attack or regulate that so that you can survive whatever happens. It seems, though, that at least 1 in 5 people come hatched with, that is, we are born with, a tendency for the mast cells to be a little bit more trigger happy. And I got to be really careful with this because it sounds very orthorexic, and I'm an eating disorder provider. And I want to say, don't be afraid of the world. Don't be afraid of stuff in it. We have to live our lives. All of that is true. But it is also true that we live amidst a lot more forever chemicals, a lot more artificial scents and dyes, and just exposures that our body never learned how to deal with because they're quite recent, probably since World War II. They're especially prevalent. Oh, it's the microplastics. It's all that stuff. And it seems likely that regular exposure to some of that stuff, we don't know it any more specifically than that, seems to sensitize people who come hatched with sensitive mast cells. And they can embark on a journey, often starting around early adolescence, where they become more and more reactive to the world around them. And what does reactive mean? It means that they are going to have a series of physical and even emotional reactions that consistently start to appear in response to what are otherwise seemingly benign exposures. So what does that look like? Having a mast cell reaction can involve so many different symptoms that people can't possibly imagine they could be related. But here are some classic ones. In fact, we have a mast cell questionnaire, which you can totally put into the show notes because it's not validated, but it's a really nice research tool. And I usually start all of our intakes with a quick screener. So here's basically what I share with people in this teaching tool. A typical mast cell reaction can involve any of the following or any combination of the following: flushing, itching, rash, redness, hives on the skin or tingly scalp, feeling feverish with or without an actual elevated temperature, feeling like you're coming down with something, that sort of achy body, sore throat, yuck feeling, pain, especially in the joints, abdomen, bones, or muscles, headache, drippy or stuffy nose, or recurrent sinus infections when it's not clear that you have bacterial issues, but it just seems like your sinuses are always mad, throat clearing or mucusiness, difficulty breathing or cough or asthma that doesn't act normally, eye irritation, edema, meaning fluid retention, especially at your feet, hands, abdomen, or face, excessive sweating, lots of digestive distress after eating, pain, nausea, bloating, loose stools, a surge in depression or suicidality or mood instability, brain fog, rapid heart rate, and fatigue. So you're like, how can all of those symptoms possibly emerge from the same thing? Especially if one person with mast cell gets a weird rash twice a year and that's it. And another person with mast cell is in the intensive care unit weekly for an anaphylactic reaction to something they don't even know they were exposed to. So it ranges hugely in terms of breadth of symptoms and then hugely in terms of severity of symptoms. And any one of those things that I just said could be a cause of anything. Like, it's super nonspecific. But when you start stacking multiple organ systems, we start being like, wait, let's look into this. So the little screener that I do is called the Rash TF mini screen. And R is for reactions. Do you feel you have physical reactions to foods, medications, scents, or body products? Yes or no? A is for alcohol. When you drink alcohol or used alcohol-based products like hand sanitizer, do you have symptoms? S is for skin. Do you often get rashes, hives, or itchy skin? H is for heat. Do you feel unwell, swollen, rashy, itchy, or fatigued after spending time in the heat or sun? Some of these patients say, I feel allergic to the sun. P is for pain. Do you experience pain regularly? And in particular, patients often say, I feel like I've always been allergic to my period. And F is for fatigue. Do you feel chronically or frequently unexpectedly fatigued? If somebody has 3 or more yeses, we invite them to fill out our full MCAS questionnaire, which again, I'm happy to put in the show notes, because it seems probable that they have something going on with their mast cells in ways that the standard treatments that we have, which are often available over the counter or before you even have a prescriber and are very low risk, might help with. And you might be like, well, why is this so tricky? Why don't you just do a blood test and diagnose it? The problem is mast cell is really tough to diagnose by blood tests because the lab have to be super specific. And that is the lab tech has to handle your samples perfectly or they're all going to look normal. So while yes, we want to get labs done when we can. And in the book, there's, a full list of all things that you can get tested. If I have a patient with typical symptoms across lots of organ systems and they score pretty highly on the MCAS Gaudiani clinic questionnaire, I might be like, shall we try looking at some trigger avoidance and some treatments in order to see if we can get this out of the way so that your ARFID isn't so triggered, so that your eating disorder of any other type isn't so triggered? And we have just seen so many patients get better. And every time I lecture on this or we post on this, I'll get at least one person who's like, oh my gosh, I have this. Not to mention like 3 patients and clients I'm thinking of right now. Or we'll get some lovely word that, from a mom in Australia, like, oh, this finally explains what my 13-year-old's been dealing with. So it's a really important, I think it might be the most important medical breakthrough in eating disorder treatment, that if in particular we train eating disorder dietitians to be aware of this and kind of screen for it, even though they're not making diagnoses, they can potentially guide patients towards clinicians who increasingly are having to accept it. There are still, unfortunately, doctors who don't believe it exists, which, they will come around. But the difference in someone's recovery.
I think when I first started hearing about mast cell, I sent them to you. I was so unfamiliar. And I think part of the treatment, maybe, let me know if this is your experience, is some trial and error. Like you might have to increase this antihistamine. Am I saying that right? Or, we might need to play with some of these things. And I think, someone that's already been dealing with this for so long, like that can be really hard. And such is the nature of eating disorders, right? Is like the treatment can feel so frustrating, but I feel like you instill such hope and optimism and also respect for your clients. And also like, we're doing this together and, what feels right to you, what feels doable. Do you agree to this kind of thing? And I think that all makes a difference too. Cause I feel like, maybe it's not so new of a diagnosis, but people don't know what it is, that the treatment isn't like, okay, there's this clear cut, this is what we do. And it might take some time. And so I don't know, has that been your experience that like, this may take some time? And what's that conversation like?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, in our clinic, my partners and I, our brilliant nurse, Abby, we just try to bring some humor to a challenging situation. We're just like, okay, so in the words of the great Brene Brown, this is going to be a bit of a street fight. And we don't know exactly how your unique body is going to respond to this or that. But we are in it with you. And we will keep working the problem with you until you feel better. And, humbly speaking, there are patients whom, despite every intention and pulling every string, I haven't been able to help. And, they keep me up at night, of course. But there have been a vast preponderance of patients who are like, wait, I had gotten afraid of eating because it felt so bad. I felt so sick when I ate. And I had gotten limited to so few foods that I had a hard time maintaining my nutrition. And then my ED was like, oh, ha, 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 I know what to do with this. But now I realize when I avoid certain environmental triggers and I take meds, I can feel good. And it is safe to work on my ED. This is another place where medical, like accidental gaslighting has led to a lack of trust in medical providers. When all these providers say, you'll feel better as soon as you're recovered. Well, yes, of course, so many things feel so much better when someone's in recovery. But if you've got something like mast cell, it might not. And if you've got POTS, your POTS isn't going to get better until your mast cell's addressed. And in the meantime, in the background of all of this, we know that there's a huge Venn diagram overlap with those who have hypermobility or what's called hypermobile Ehlers Danlos syndrome, where these are just the stretchy folks. These the like, look how I can put my leg behind my head. Or, when I stretch my elbow out, my arm is a little rainbow. They're stretchy people. And since it's usually hypermobile Ehlers Danlos is not a genetic from birth issue, I suspect that years of having your connective tissues nibbled on by mast cell mediators that are inappropriately released drives worsening hypermobility. And so we then have problems with digestion and intestinal motility and all of this stuff, all of which become barriers for our wonderful patients in their recovery work. So it's like you have to keep something complex. And you have to hold on to the idea that someone in their body may be living something that you don't understand, but as their physician or their medical provider, you believe it and you commit to them to keep working through it and witnessing them until they start to feel better.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that like Ehlers-Danlos and mast cell, for example, they can be exclusive or they tend to overlap, or can they be exclusive and they can co-occur?
And you can have hypermobility and not have mast cell, or you can have mast cell and not have hypermobility. But there's a lot of bendy people who have mast cell and who feel a little, spots in their vision when they stand up, and their body takes a while to sort of reset itself. And these folks, when they do get what's called dysautonomia, their autonomic nervous system gets out of whack. That's like sort of your operating system being out of whack on your phone. If everything's not talking to each other right, the apps aren't going to work as well, and you're not going to have the function that you want. And the same is in the human body. So it's in the process of being like, we love you, we want you. You might be the patient whom the eating disorder programs are like, oh no, you're too complex, you're too this, you're too demanding, you're too somatic. We have a lot of people who were told you have somatic symptom disorder, you've got conversion disorder, you have Munchausen, you're making things up, you have factitious disorder. And then when they come to us and we talk to them, we're like, oh, love, you got mast cell. And all of the things you've been advocating for, like, could I please have a feeding tube, were absolutely spot on. And your intuition was right, but it was treated as being a problem child. This is all part of the treatment trauma that occurs, that if we can help a whole new generation of clinicians recognize that this is out there, it's real, and that we can really help patients psychologically and medically, we will see fewer eating disorders. We will see less persistent eating disorders and lower severity. People will suffer less. And that's the whole point.
Whole point. Yeah, really. That would be so nice. Yeah, that's a dream, right? And like, it feels like lately with like the GLP-1s that we're kind of going backwards in a lot of ways. And this has been on my mind for so long. So what are your thoughts on GLP-1s, which are also complicated and I know initially designed for people with diabetes and has since exploded to sort of treat this obesity epidemic, which is just a horrible, horrible term. Don't get me started. But yeah, what are your thoughts on GLP-1s? Like, what are you seeing in your clinic? How are you working with this?
I think probably a few years ago, I would have jumped right up on my soapbox and led with, my spear of light and, just be super passionate and like absolutely no in no circumstances. And I would have been wrong because, again, complex situations require complex, balanced assessments. So let's talk a little bit about the obvious ills and dangers of GLP-1s. And I also want to talk, in all fairness, about some ways in which they may be extremely helpful for highly select, carefully picked patients. GLP-1s have to date no good medical literature about their appropriate use ever in someone with an eating disorder. So that's the first thing to say. And we know that medical literature is limited by who's doing the testing, who's being tested, and how it's being reported. But we do not have, there's nowhere that's like, hooray, we've figured out the solution to food noise in, an eating disorder is to use a GLP-1, because for the most part, food noise in eating disorders comes from food restriction, because all eating disorders involve some sort of restriction. And the food noise comes from a completely appropriate biological drive where your beautiful cave person brain is saying, please feed me, please feed me. I'm going to think about food all day because I'm not getting what I need. And that's regardless of body shape or size. Many of my patients are like, oh, Dr. G, I've heard this med, which incidentally happens to cause weight loss, helps with food noise. I would like my food noise improved. And we're like, okay, well, let's slow this down and have a conversation. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that they are totally skewed in their availability towards only the most financially resourced people, whether that's an insurance plan or cash out of pocket to pay $500 a month to access a med that insurance wouldn't otherwise cover because it's off label. Anything that combines the potential for acquiring thin privilege, which is still one of the most powerful constructs in our society. We wish it weren't, but it is, with unequal access is a big problem. It's a social justice problem. It's an access to care problem. And we know that there are people who are misusing them in the sense that those who have extra cash resources are so drawn in by diet culture that their passionate desire to lose X number of pounds leads them inappropriately to start a GLP-1, which very likely will lead to medical undernutrition and all of the medical complications that I write about in the book, both psychological and physical medical complications. So all of those things are real. However, I want to be really gentle and thoughtful here, because it looks like, and again, this is not accessible to everyone yet, therefore it remains a meaningful problem. It looks like in very low doses, which are not FDA approved, GLP-1s have a potent anti-inflammatory use that, after everything else has been tried in certain diseases like mast cell, may be a game changer in converting someone from barely being able to get out of bed and barely being able to engage with the world because they have allergic reactions to everything, to living a quality of life that is acceptable to them. And that's only appropriate when done alongside a dietitian who can make sure they're nourishing in a way that they're not becoming malnourished, they're not losing weight, et cetera. So very subtle. I don't want anyone to come away from this podcast and be like, wow, Dr. G thinks everybody should be on a GLP-1. Like, absolutely.
Yes.
But I want to be as sophisticated as possible. In part, I haven't really thought about it this way before, but it occurs to me that keeping a balanced perspective on this and really trying to stay in the complexity is a political statement. Because I think that being too one-sided on an issue has led to political polarization and certain political outcomes that have not served the country well. And so if I can be, with all of my privilege and all of my background and expertise, if I can keep a complicated subject matter complicated and recognize that there are those who are in much larger bodies, who are eating consistently and moving to the ability that they can, it is known that for some of those people, GLP-1s as a weight loss agent can be very beneficial. We are not prescribing them for that purpose in our clinic. We are not a weight loss clinic. We never will be. There are tons of doctors who will do that. That's not us. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to slam the door shut on or be mean about people for whom that's been helpful, because it's their own body's experience. So all of these things, it's also worth saying, of course, the GLP-1s have been around for a zillion years in the non-weight loss doses for diabetes as very safe and effective medications. And that the side effects for GLP-1s, even for someone for whom it's otherwise indicated and they're safe and sound, may be intolerable. So even if they would otherwise benefit, they're not going to be able to use them because the gastroparesis is too severe, the nausea is too severe, et cetera. So it's complex. They should never be used for someone with an eating disorder, except in extremely expert clinician circumstances where we know how to do all of the little ins and outs of cautious education and monitoring. And it is clearly a beneficial medication for many.
What I'm hearing you say is that in response to a complex problem, we need to be creative. And when you shut the door on something and say, no, absolutely not, you shut off any type of creative response or solution. And I think that's so brilliant. That's your brilliant mind at work. And so thank you. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Another maybe messy topic, if you will.
Bring it. I'm in.
I have a couple more questions. But one is, if we can, when I saw like you writing a little bit about like probiotics and supplements, I was like, I started sweating. I was like, oh God, because I think because I didn't know, I don't know about them. And I really wondered what you would say about them. And so, and in particular, I had a client that I was thinking about in mind, diagnosed with SIBO. And I just, wrote her initials in your book. And I was like, she needs to read this. And I know you're not a doctor, but like, because this client of mine is so frustrated with this reoccurring SIBO. And I'm like, well, maybe some of these like supplements could help. And like, they have all these long names and I've never heard of them, but like, what's your thoughts in general on using like probiotics and supplements? And not that we're all going to run to like GNC after this and like treat ourselves, but like, how do you like use probiotics and supplements in your clinic?
Yeah, absolutely. So good news. In the second edition of the book, there's an entire chapter on complex digestive conditions. And I really go as in depth into all of the different things that go into this really important topic for those with eating disorders. But let's focus on SIBO a little bit. So SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And our colon, our large intestine, should be chock full of wonderfully diverse bacteria because they are absolutely necessary for normal human function. And we couldn't live without them. The small intestine, which is many, many, many feet and is right before the large intestine, should really not have many bacteria in it. It should be relatively sterile. And what happens when our gut function slows, that is, the wriggle in our guts seems to slow down, is that bacteria from the large intestine can creep upstream and set up shop in the small intestine where they don't belong. When they do that, they start to come into contact with food earlier and begin to ferment it and use it earlier and produce a lot of inflammation and a lot of gas. The symptoms that result from that can range from modest discomfort and bloating to massive bloating, tons of diarrhea or severe constipation, depends on the person, inflammation that ends up making joints and bones hurt and gives you brain fog. It's a major trigger for mast cell if the person has MCAS. And it can lead to such fear of eating that even a really well-established recovery can take because you're just afraid to eat. And then anyone who goes online, because it takes 4 months to get in to see their primary care doctor, reads like, oh, shoot, am I supposed to restrict a bunch of foods if I have SIBO? And they're like, well, part of me finds that very intriguing. And, suddenly a well-recovered ED is on fuego again. So here's the things you think about. First of all, what has caused the slowing of the gut in general to set someone up for SIBO? Well, caloric restriction is a major driver of slowed GI function. So actually, we can use a goal of preventing SIBO or preventing recurrent SIBO as motivation for somebody to be like, I know it's exam period, or I know you're about to go through a job change, but do not restrict. Because if you restrict even for a week, your guts may slow down and those bacteria are going to climb right back up and we're going to have to start that all over again. So that's a really beautiful motivation to keep eating consistently because it keeps your gut function optimized. 2, SIBO doesn't just go away. It's not just going to go away on its own. And so there are very specific breath tests that one can do, and we sometimes do for a patient when they've got SIBO. Also, though, we see so much complex functional GI stuff in our clinic. It is one of the major things that people come to us for, that we tend to have a bit of a sense for like, this feels like SIBO. And where a test requires somebody to alter their food intake for a day or two, especially if they have comorbid OCD, for instance, we don't want them to get off the bandwagon of like eating the consistent stuff every day, because we know that if you don't do it one day, it'd be really hard to pick it up and get back on meal plan the next. So if we have a sense of like, either you've had SIBO before and this feels like a recurrence, or we've done a bunch of other stuff and it's not helping, probably SIBO is the last man standing, then we treat. And there's a couple of different options to treat SIBO, none of which involve low FODMAP diets. I never recommend low FODMAP diets. The FODMAPs are a type of complex carbohydrate, and low FODMAP items are breathtakingly numerous. And when you're really trying to eat low FODMAP, you have very little left. And low FODMAP diets were never, ever meant to be used more than about 4 weeks maximum, because we know that medical malnutrition actually begins within 4 weeks of being on a low FODMAP diet because it's just so limited. And B, it's so easy for someone with an eating disorder to take a 4-week recommendation, not have sufficient medical provider or dietitian oversight, and just be like, I can never eat these foods again, which really puts them into a bad spiral for so many reasons. So first we say, we want you to eat all the good foods and continue to nourish throughout because you have to. However, that's not to say that you should be achingly uncomfortable every time you eat. And we're just like, well, deal with it. That's your, situation you have to deal with. Rather, it's our responsibility as medical providers to try to ease that for you. So there are 2 pathways you can go down for SIBO treatment. One of them is standard Western antibiotics. Typically, that's either rifaximin or rifaximin plus neomycin for 2 to 4 weeks. And both of them have side effects that need to be discussed. And sometimes you have to work on some insurance authorization for them. But that's a really effective route to go and very appropriate for many patients. Another pathway, especially if someone's been exposed to a lot of antibiotics, is to use evidence-based herbal alternatives that actually have randomized controlled trials behind them, where there have been blinded randomized controlled trials that show that certain herbals are actually non-inferior to Western antibiotics. And those 2 are FC-cidal and dysbiocide. I can let everybody know that the clinic has absolutely no financial interest in anything I'm talking about. We don't sell it. We don't benefit from its being sold. We got no relationship. We don't even have a lunch rep who buys us Starbucks. So we can't stay really, really clean on all of that. So when patients are like, I would like to try herbal first, FC-cidal, dispiacide, and then I add one called atrantil, are a really nice combination. You do 2 of each twice a day for about a month. Symptoms often get worse around week 3 or 4. That can be due to bacterial die-off. And then they start to regulate. And, we don't have good data on whether probiotics subsequently help keep someone's gut healthy. We know that eating a good, consistent, adequate meal plan with plenty of variety and plenty of carbs, because you literally cannot biologically maintain a healthy gut microbiome if you're on a low carb meal plan. Those things are vital. And some patients are like, yeah, I'd like to try a good probiotic. And we have a few that we think work best. Those with mast cell usually can only take what's called spore-based probiotics, because the other ones can be histaminergic in their gut. So it's all these little subtle details to just be aware of. And, oftentimes patients sometimes will need to be treated for some fungal overgrowth as well. But then their tummies feel good. And they're like, okay, it's still hard for me to do recovery work, but I have fewer barriers now. I get it. I need to push forward because I do not want that to happen again.
It's great. And it's on page 152 and 153, which I have turned to. I'm following along. No, I literally, I shared this with my client because she's been struggling so much. And I was like, I know nothing about this and I know nothing about supplements, but, maybe you can talk to your doctor about this. And I think that her primary care was resisting referring her to a SIBO specialist because they were waiting for it to be severe. I was like,
oh, for heaven's
this
sake,
feels severe to me. We've been talking about this for months. And
that's literally a not sick enough problem.
Yes.
The doctor has said, you're not sick enough to get the referral that could help you.
I know. I told her, I was like, you are, and you need to. And so get the name and go. And if I don't have any power in this at all, but I'm happy to talk to your doctor if I can help at all. But anyway, yeah, super frustrating. So this feels like my signature question on the Wise Body podcast. I like to ask all my guests this, which is, what is your, Dr. G, what is your most frequently asked question and how do you answer it?
So many good candidates.
I know. You can just pick one. You can say this is one of the 100 that I get asked.
Yeah. One of the ones that I really love is, how do I as the patient, or I as the parent, or I as the partner of the patient help create an environment at home that makes it less likely that eating disorders can take root or can flourish? It's a prevention question, which always is important. It's a parenting question, which I love. My girls are almost 17 and almost 20 now. And I've thought a lot about this since we have a family history of eating disorders. And that's what got me into the field in the first place. And so we're set up genetically for it. And the question is, how can we optimize an environment? To be clear, parents don't cause eating disorders. This has been long known. But the environment that we establish and sustain in our homes is relevant to the human trying to recover, to their loved ones. And this relates to people of any age, but I might talk about it from the perspective maybe of parents who don't have eating disorders, or I don't know, maybe they do, who are trying to either optimize the home environment so that their loved one can recover in as healthy a space as possible, or optimize a home environment to make it less likely that their loved one ends up with an eating disorder in the first place. Just what are the protective things we can do? And I think these are relevant because we think about experiments where you've got an animal model that's predisposed, for instance, to anxiety or to stress. And we know that when that genetic model is raised in a highly nurturing environment, it's much less likely to express the worst aspects, the most painful aspects of those traits. And so nurture matters. So how do we nurture? And I like to think about a couple of different things. One, I'm a big fan of Don't talk about your body positively or negatively. Don't say anything except sort of like, I'm so happy I can climb this mountain, or not to be ableist about it. I'm so grateful that I can sit here with you and read a book. I think it's really important not to comment on other people's bodies, not, wow, cousin Marge is looking a little X, Y, or Z, not look at that guy on TV. He's so ripped. Not even he looks so strong. Functional comments are fine. Look how fast she is. Look how strong she is because she's in the process of doing something that evidently requires strength, but not how strong she looks. Because we have to try to ease away in our own family cultures the mistake that humans easily make, and which is reinforced in social media and society all the time, that you can tell someone's health from how they look. You can't. I can't tell you how many patients come into my clinic suicidally depressed and with 3-organ failure, who just the day before their visit, somebody stopped them in the street and they were like, oh my God, you look so amazing. You look so healthy. What's your secret? So, no. And I think that we can give children, especially, as much independence as possible without a belief that they're actually going to come to injury from it. And you might be like, wow, that's the first 2 I could have gotten to, Dr. G, but like, what's that last one? What is that? I think my generation of parents, I'm 49, has tended to be hyper protective of our kids. And I get it. There's a lot of shit out there, and we need to protect them from certain really key things like too much screen time, social media. But my generation of parents got very conservative about, can a child cross the street by themselves? Can they wield a kitchen knife while helping you make dinner? Can they turn the oven on? Can they fry an egg for themselves? Can they cut their own meat? The number of times that I've been out with friends, etc., and I see one of my dear friends casually reach over and start to cut their 13-year-old steak for them. And I'm like, oh, okay now. And this is a problem, because in 3 years, your child's going to be driving. So, it turns out that by protecting them from everything and feeling like the world is such a threat, we defang them, we take away their teeth, we declaw them in ways that prevents them from developing sense of self-efficacy. Kids are designed to do trial and error and to make mistakes and learn socially and figure out how to do things. And if you've never been allowed to do things by yourself, you're likelier to say the only thing I can control is my food and my body shape. We want kids to feel like I have control over a lot of things because I'm kind of a badass who knows how to do stuff in the world. So that feels really, really important. And I like to say, I have a metaphor about a safety net. So a safety net under a trapeze artist should be close enough to the artist that if they fall, when they fall, they won't die or come to severe injury. But it should be far away enough from the trapeze artist that they can do all of their tricks and have full freedom to swoop and soar and spin. And my belief is that a lot of parents in my generation have been swaddling their children in the safety net. They are straitjacketed in their safety net. And this does not create safe kids, even if today you don't have to worry about whether they're going to cross the street and get hit by a car. It actually creates a lack of safety. So I would rather the focus be on intensive resistance to online worlds and profound encouragement of as unrestricted, safely unmonitored play in the analog world, IRL, as possible, because that is what gives our kids a lot of structure. And to be able to speak frankly as they get older about diet culture and size stigma and how they're going to hear things in the world. We can't prevent that. But that's not what we believe in our family. My kids joke with me all the time that constantly through their youth, I was like, other families can do X, Y, or Z. That's not what we do in our family. But now they do it too. And it's very funny. And I think that they'll probably take that forward. And it is protective. Family culture is protective.
Yeah, I heard that recently there are Big Little Feelings, and there are these two moms on Instagram, and they were talking about, it was a recent post about like the world is scary right now, but our homes can be this safe haven. And for our kids, like, especially younger kids, that's all they know, right? And so like that's the most important thing, is to keep, that sense of like safety and also like learning. And that's so important. And I think this idea that you're talking about in terms of like generating autonomy or supporting autonomy, generating curiosity, that speaks to, I think, how you practice too. It's like, tell me like what's going on and tell me how it feels to be in your body and in this body and what are your symptoms and things like that. And so again, the sense of like empowering your patients to tell them their real experience. I have to share, because I wrote it in my book, of like how beautifully written this was. And I think it's related to a little bit about what we're talking about, which is this idea that like, this is a complex problem, eating disorders. And I think, we need to respond in a creative, open way. And so I'm just going to read your words, because I think this is so beautifully written, and it's about like dairy intolerance. Sorry to throw this in, but like you were talking, I think this is from your orthorexia and food intolerance chapter. And you wrote, for someone with an eating disorder where the line can get blurry between food intolerances and the discomfort of a starved digestive system, I set a fairly high standard for being allowed to avoid a whole food group such as dairy. If patients have no symptoms when off dairy and consistently have symptoms when consuming dairy, even when they take lactase, then I will concede its omission. Like this, so beautifully written. Like, then I get it. Then okay, if that's right for you, right, to have a little less dairy, like, but to not cut it completely out, and let's not be scared of dairy, and it's not the enemy. And right, I think so often food becomes an enemy and our bodies are the enemy, and they're not. And so how can we work with our wise bodies that know? And so anyway, all that is to say, I'm like, the world is better because you are in it, Dr. G. And I am better for knowing you. I have the chills. And for having this hour plus, I can't believe how much time you've given me to talk to you about these things that are so complex and so interesting. And thank you for shedding light. And I feel just really just so inspired by you and so hopeful about this work. And I love that I know you, and thank you so much for being here. And is there anything that you want to conclude with, or I want to end with you?
Oh, no, just thank you so much for having me on and for giving me the opportunity to share about all of these things that I'm so excited and passionate about with your wonderful listeners. And I think it's always reasonable to end just with a reminder to everyone listening right now, today, in this moment, take care of yourself in the way you uniquely need. No one else knows how you need to be taken care of better than you. So listen to that, honor that, and be gentle and kind to yourself.
I love that. Yeah, thank you. What a beautiful way to end. I feel more knowledgeable, more inspired. And so thank you for you. Thank you for your books. And I feel this concludes a level 500 medical school class. Like, you're just so brilliant. And I love learning from you. And I really do feel inspired. I wish I went to medical school. I took a different path, and that's okay because I have your books. I can't wait for the second edition. So thank you again for being on. And maybe we'll have you back on to talk about the second edition next year.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen in this week. I'm so glad you're here with me as we learn more from our wise bodies and about eating disorder recovery. For more, follow me on social media, and please share the Wise Body podcast with your friends. Lastly, if you're interested in a free client consultation, please reach out on drhughes.com. And remember, always take care of yourself and your temple. See you next time on the Wise Body podcast.